In the grand tradition of playing the latest Obsidian game and thinking about how Bethesda would have done it worse or better, The Outer Worlds 2 has got me thinking a lot about its space-bound solo space sim sister from another studio, Starfield, which, as we all know, left a lot to be desired from various portions of the community.
Shame we can't just tell them kindly to bugger off.
For some, it wasn't Bethesda enough. For others, it was too Bethesda. The mod scene is DOA, the first big DLC was rubbish. And while we're on the subject, where's the second one they teased about 500 years ago? Can DLC even begin to address the problems Starfield has, which are, fundamentally, that it's really tedious? Former Bethesda game designer Bruce Nesmith recently admitted that Starfield isn't as good as the studio's other universes of Elder Scrolls and Fallout, lamenting the game's over-reliance on procedurally generated content and also, which I think got a lot of people's backs up, that space is inherently boring. The thing is, he's not wrong about that. We even call it space, because that's all it is, for trillions and trillions of miles. You might think it's a long way to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space. Listen, genuinely, that is the defining problem for every game designer who has ever tackled space. How do you fill the unfillable? How do you make space exploration fun? How do you make space travel compelling? There is no correct approach, but the space adventure genre of video game, by and large, makes it work in the same way that its counterpart on television does, by reducing space travel itself to an inconvenience along the lines of intercity bus travel or pressing some buttons, and by filling every planet with more or less the same stuff, whether we're talking about procedurally generated video game content or on-location shooting in the woods near Vancouver. Space games have to make fundamental choices at the design stage about how much space stuff they actually want to do. No Man's Sky, for instance, goes all in on procedural generation, for better or worse, boasting a potential 18 quintillion planets getting spat out of its algorithmic guts. So that's some realistically vast space with realistically wide distances between realistically huge planets. But those planets don't orbit their suns, they don't have seasons, it doesn't have any realistic systems that govern the position of its celestial bodies or the flow of trade across its various civilizations. No Man's Sky is not a space sim, it's a crafting and inventory management game with immaculate sci-fi vibes, full of infinite resources to seek out and gather to your own ends. Not a space sim as such, but a stuff sim. Interplanetary travel in No Man's Sky is less a simulation and more an elaborate loading screen, achieved with a lot of trickery that's pretty obvious once you notice it. Not a diss, not a complaint. Trickery is how video games achieve basically anything complicated. It's an entire art form that relies on the same basic misdirection as pretending to steal a toddler's nose. Oh, I've got your nose, wee man. Think that's a spaceship you're flying, do you silly b***? Ever since the seminal Elite on 8-bit computers about 4,000 years ago, the broad type of game that No Man's Sky is has always been a yardstick of video gaming's highest ambitions and hardest limitations. In the early days, the most desired and least achievable feature of the genre was the ability to get off the damn ship. Paradoxically, this is what I always wanted to do in a space sim when I was a kid. Just get out and walk around. 1993's Frontier Elite 2 from David Braben, which is still a ludicrously impressive piece of galactic simulation, allowed you to live another life in a speculative sci-fi future as a jobbing sort of contractor, explorer, mercenary, bounty hunter, pirate, drug smuggler, petty criminal, chartered passenger shuttle, whatever you want, in a vast, hyper-detailed simulation of the Milky Way galaxy where you could actually land on planets, which was mind-blowing at the time. And it wasn't achieved with a convenient cutscene or a fade to white as you hit cloud cover like in that Star Wars Outlaws game, which I actually like a lot, but that's by the by. But in Frontier Elite 2, you could fly into a planet's atmosphere, jet around like an airplane, land, take off again, and speed off toward another entire planet that's millions of miles away completely seamlessly, never once breaking out of that simulation. This still remains a vanishingly rare feature in the space genre over 30 years later, but what you can't do in Frontier Elite 2 is park up and go to Space McDonald's like you can in Starfield, which is, I think, where Starfield actually shines, by leveraging that Bethesda magic, that unique sense of inhabiting a lived-in world where people drink tea and chat about the weather. Starfield brings a human factor to the space sim that's usually jarringly absent from the game. It says a lot that the worst bits of Starfield, the bits everyone hates, are the vast stretches of real estate populated by procedural generation, or in other words, the parts where the human factor is least involved. Convincingly sending a player to space in a video game is about as difficult as actually flying someone up there. Well, it's not really, but go with me on this, right? In both cases, there's copious amounts of energy and weird maths involved, and the nagging question of whether it's even worth the trouble. Games like the Mass Effect trilogy and the Outer Worlds saga feature no direct spaceflight at all, but fling players into intriguing worlds of combat, politics, archaeology, and espionage in much the same way as their fantasy counterparts do, but with blinking control panels and alien landscapes as a backdrop instead of, I don't know, castles and rivers full of discarded excrement. And they're all the better for it, because instead of trying to answer questions like, how do we convincingly portray astronomical distances while the player is sat in the cockpit, they're answering more pertinent questions like, can I pump the blue NB Science Princess? With, yes, you can pump the blue NB Science Princess. I'm not saying that space flight, space exploration, landing on random planets and sniffing around, I'm not saying those things shouldn't ever be attempted. I guess I'm saying that a Starfield sequel, if one ever happens, should be more stringent about its priorities. Push the Todd Howard sliders up and pull the David Braben sliders back down. And I'm not being facetious here. Every studio that's tackled the space sim has started with the same basic ingredients and fiddled about with the sliders to get to their particular vision. That is always compromised in some way, because you can't just do everything in a video game. It's like a video game in and of itself. You've got a finite amount of time and resources, and so you've got to decide where best to deploy them. And the choices you make early on in that process limit what you can do later on. What questions do you ask when you start making a space sim? Are we going to focus on combat or exploration? If we focus on exploration, are we talking about a wilderness of spacebound curiosities, or are we making planetfall? If we're landing on planets, what's the ratio of lonely sunsets on barren rocks versus bustling cities and interstellar civilization? Can we land anywhere on a planet, or only in hand-designed, predetermined areas? Does this have multiplayer? What do we do about Earth? Do we just not have Earth? Do we contrive some in-universe reason why we can't go there? Do we try and actually depict Earth somehow with all of its buildings and people and different types of tree and individual portions of marmalade and complimentary hotel breakfasts? You've got to pick a lane. That's why No Man's Sky is a crafting and inventory management game with a sci-fi backdrop rather than an actual space sim with Newtonian flight physics and orbital modelling. That's why Elite Dangerous is interstellar truck simulator with a bit of dogfighting. That's why The Outer Worlds has nothing whatsoever to do with flying spaceships outside of cutscenes, and therefore isn't really a space sim at all. But it feels like with Starfield, Bethesda didn't really pick a lane. They kind of tried to do everything. And for my money, it's a noble effort. If you stick to the authored stuff, the main story and faction quests, the side content that isn't obviously being spat out of an objective generator, is pretty good. It often feels like Skyrim in space, which is what we all wanted, right? And it has that level of micro detail that makes Bethesda games so compelling. The mundane stuff that just makes the world come together. You can fling a sandwich down a hallway or steal a parsnip, eat at Denny's, wear a hat, whatever you want. Not to mention the shipbuilder, which is just an incredible standout feature that everyone loves for good reason. But Starfield also fancies itself a bit of Elite's gig economy and dogfighting, neither of which it does particularly well. It has a smattering of the No Man's Sky stuff, procedurally generated planet surfaces, land anywhere, gather resources with a mining laser, build bases, marvel at the local flora and fauna, but why? The game rarely gives you a reason to actually engage with any of those systems. They're just kind of there. Every time you land on a planet, the game generates this massive square map with about 5 points of disinterest, or more or less the same 5 points of interest that you get wherever else you land on any other planet in the game. And the distance between those points of interest is comically large, to the point where the most requested quality of life update to the game turned out to be a Mako, a space car, A thing that everyone hated in Mass Effect but became blessed relief here because it cut out so much of Starfield's tedium. And Starfield knows that it's boring. That's why the bulk of its traversal is actually just the fast travel system. For all the time that's been spent on letting you fly the ship, you rarely actually have to do it, which flies in the face of Todd Howard's grand vision of a NASA-inspired space sim that we'd all find compelling because of the tactile equipment and the wonder of staring at edge-lit planets from orbit and thinking about Carl Sagan's pale blue dot monologue because, as ever, he's trying to relive his mid-20th century American youth via the power of Gamebryo. Can you imagine how baffled Carl Sagan would have been by Starfield?
I don't know why this video game is so embarrassed to actually let me play it.
The point is this: there's so much in Starfield that's completely worthless, from its core ideas to its vast empty spaces. There are premium add-ons that add everything from dungeons and crash sites to full-on faction quests, companions and DLC-sized expansions. There could be a lot more, but the modding community abandoned Starfield in droves after the base game turned out to be such a damp squib. And it pains me because I still think Bethesda doing a space game is exactly what I want from this entire hobby, despite this hobbled first attempt. At the risk of sounding like Edge magazine in the 90s, I want to get out of the ship and talk to people. I want to go to the shop and buy a snazzy outfit. I want to read people's emails and steal their stuff. I want to break into cabins and rifle through suitcases on an enormous interstellar cruise ship full of rich arseholes. That mission was really cool, by the way. Now, I know that the Outer Worlds games and Starfield actually have very little in common beyond some superficial similarities. They are, and should be, utterly distinct. But there's one thing I want Starfield 2 to take from Outer Worlds, and it's this: confine the whole thing to one solar system, or a handful of solar systems. Cut all that empty space down to a few planets worth. Solar systems are diverse places. The one we live in is everything from subterranean oceans of ice moons to the peaks of Martian mountains, storms of liquid methane, cascading sheets of molten metal, shops called Boots that sell deodorant, sandwiches, chewing gum, umbrellas, but not actual boots. You don't need 1,000 planets to compel me to explore. You need something worth exploring. That's why Hello Games is obviously betting that the No Man's Sky concept works just as well on a single planet as it does on a quintillion. And you might think that the idea of a Starfield sequel being 1,000 times smaller than the original is a ludicrous proposition, because video game sequels have to be bigger and better every time, right? But Bethesda themselves have learnt this lesson before. The Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall boasted a procedurally generated world twice the size of the island of Great Britain, but there was nothing there more compelling than Swindon on a Tuesday afternoon. The game was enormous and therefore boring. And you could sit there and go, well, life in a quasi-medieval fantasy world probably would have been kind of a slog, horses aren't very fast, everyone's got diphtheria. Or you could go back to the drawing board and make Morrowind, a sequel to Daggerfall that was a decimal point of a percentage of the size, but a billion times more interesting. Because rather than being filled in with a computer program making Lego towns, everything in Morrowind was hand-placed and handcrafted. Whether it's procedural generation, machine learning, large language models, replacing voice actors with speak and spell text-to-speech nonsense or whatever, computers can fill endless blank spaces with increasingly less prompting now than they used to need. But as we know from decades of video game history, none of it is worth a f*** without the human factor. If you take that away, you've got nothing. And given that Starfield's biggest triumph is that it brings humanity to the fore in a genre that often sidelines it, it not only makes sense, but it's imperative on Starfield 2 to narrow its scope and double down on the human factor. If they actually make a sequel, I suppose we'll find out by 2070. Jim, why have you made a video about Starfield in 2025? I don't know, something to do, right? It's not as if Valve have just announced a console.